And I'm very excited to talk to you. I saw your interview with Ilya
Great.
this last few, and that was an amazing interview. I'm a little jealous. It was so good. It made me nervous.
That's a good thing to be nervous.
Yeah. Well, it was very comprehensive, and I really enjoyed it very much. Let me see if I can get this thing to record properly.
You're a musician too, Mike?
I am. Yes, I'm a pianist. I teach also, which is really what made me interested when I saw your initial stuff.
Okay, great. It's working?
It is almost working. I just need to turn this off. Exit program. I just started something else to try it, and
yeah, okay.
Okay, we're good.
Okay,
we're live.
Fine. Again, we learned something.
We did. We did indeed. Well, okay. Hello, welcome to And If Love Remains. I am just thrilled to have as a guest Wim Winters. It's somebody who I have been following on YouTube for about a year or so. And he's got some very interesting ideas, controversial in some circles, about music, about classical music and historical music. What would you consider yourself? I know you're a keyboardist, specifically an organist, but you also play the harpsichord, the piano, very well.
Yeah.
Clavichord, yes. And but you're also a music historian, a music reconstructionist. How would you describe yourself?
Well, I think you did a pretty well job. I mean, I play keyboard instrument. I started with the organ, classical organ, and I went to Amsterdam in the 90s, so the previous century, so to say, already. And then, not to make us feel old, but anyways, right. There I started with organ in a wonderful class of Jacques van Oortmessen, and I was introduced to so many aspects of what we would call today early music. That's typically what I think in those conservatories here in Europe, what organ study is about. And after 2 years, I entered as a second main instrument, also piano class. And basically from those two worlds, actually, it was unique. I was in a unique position in a way to combine those two worlds, from organ, which is basically considered early music, and piano, which was, I mean, the mainstream piano class. I would say mainstream, what we would say today, mainstream meaning the way pianists play. And so I started to see some things that were a little bit off. And there started my interest in combining all of that stuff together. But calling me a musicologist is maybe a little bit overrating myself. I'm a musician who, from a very practical standpoint, tries to understand the score. In fact, that's what you could say. Yeah. Trying to understand the score.
I think that's powerful. I think trying to read a score is really an art in itself, trying to understand what a composer's intentions are or were, and making that or turning that into an audio symbol of what we hear is a powerful thing, and it's something that we all try to achieve as a musician. And some people, I think, try to interpret things in their own way, and other people try to very systematically figure out what the composer was intending. What's your approach on this?
Well, to say it's very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, if you say musical notation is something, if you compare that to words, it's even, I mean, words have a meaning that we can study the meaning of a word that was used 200 years ago by putting it into a context. We have a lot of text, but musical notes, of course, are what they are. They are a very sober and actually very poor reflection of what is in the composer's mind. And if you add on top of that the idea that notation is something that changes during time. Notation in the 17th century was not the same as in the 18th century, not the same as in the 19th century. It's somehow connected. But right. Still, there were some things that people just knew, that they just accepted. So notation is always given in a time where some rules were there that we might have lost or not see as much, as clear as they did in those days. So when we say today, like, the score should be in the center of it all, we actually mean the intentions, the musical intentions that the composer had in mind. those should be always front and center of what we do. And perhaps we must add a little aspect to that, but that might be already a little bit of provocation. I sometimes have the feeling that today it's a lot about the performer, and maybe a little too little about what the composer would have wanted. And to to share a secret with you, or maybe not a secret even, that was already a problem early 19th century.
Right. Yeah, I think, I know there's an idea that I've heard where when a composer writes a music and it's performed, there's really three composers in a way. There's the composer who wrote the music, there's the artist that performs the music. And I want to get into that a little bit about how, it's a relative, I won't say new, but it's relatively new for artists to play other composers where composers played their own work earlier. And then the third is the audience and how they interpret it, and really the public. For example, how we hear a piece of music. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, a wonderful pianist, about how we hear music cannot be exactly the same as how a 19th century person heard music, and to try to put our the how we hear things into that context is literally impossible. And
yeah, that's a great point, because that's what we should realize. The whole early music movement started, of course, from the idea to reconstruct that music from that time. But there is a lot we can say about that, but that may be for later. But we will never be able anymore to reconstruct that time. That's gone
right.
forever. And every day that we live is a day further away from Beethoven and Chopin and all the others. The conventions change, new ideas come to surface, and what have you. And but the idea is interesting. How
Yes.
many people want to go back in time to hear Chopin play, to hear Bach play, to hear Beethoven play? But yet, if you come with an idea, like, listen, guys, have some facts that we might overlook that are very important to reconstruct that performance, because that's what we then looking for. We are reconstructing not the music, we are reconstructing the performance that Beethoven would have given from his Hammerklavier sonata, right? But if you then bring to the surface some forgotten elements, or some elements that we might claim to look into very, very seriously, but if you look into the music itself and the performances we actually overlook all the time, then people say, yeah, but it can never have been like that. So there is something, a twist here that we have to correct. Do we really want to go back in time? Is that really what we want? Well, then I have news for you. Then we have to put everything we know aside and start from scratch, not once in your lifetime, but every day. Because
Right.
you come across so many things that you say, oh my God, how can I interpret this? How can I do that? This doesn't work, or this doesn't make sense. So to make it work, and that changes your view every day. The great thing about this is it's very exciting to do that.
It is very exciting, and I love your passion. That's one of the things that really attracted me to your channel. By the way, this is Wim Winters. He is the owner. He owns AuthenticSound.org. Is that correct?
Yes, it's true.
And also the YouTube channel Authentic Sound. And so let's discuss a little bit the problem. We talked about it a little bit. The problem being, do we want to, if we had a time machine and could go back and listen to how Bach played, or how Beethoven, or even more precisely, if we had a time machine and a mind machine where we could hear what Beethoven had in mind before he wrote down the music, what would that sound like? What would that be like? Is that articulating the problem
Well, in
properly?
fact, what we are looking for, at least what we what we are looking for, what we would hope to reconstruct, is of course those 10 seconds before Beethoven started to note down his Fifth Symphony. What was going on in his mind? And we will
Right.
never ever be able to do that. But yeah, I mean, what we are focusing on now on the channel a lot is tempo reconstruction. It has always been such a surprise for me that those metronome marks, which in fact are nothing less than the exact tempo indications those composers left, that we are just actually in the reality ignore those, because they they will bring us closer than anything else.
Okay, that's a great point. That's what I wanted to ask you, because you have been focusing a lot on the tempo reconstruction and what that is, and your ideas. Tell me, why is that so critical? And a lot, because a lot of my listeners aren't, they aren't musicians specifically, but why is that so critical for you to get the tempo correct? And why? How does that change the whole feel of a piece, or what you're trying to communicate through music?
Well, yeah, to start with, I would say, people are sometimes confused when they hear me say, like, there is no right and wrong. And I mean by that, we as musicians today are entitled to our own opinions, to our own interpretations. We
Mm-hmm.
are solely responsible for what we bring to our audiences. So I like to make this disclaimer, because if you talk about tempo reconstruction, and certainly about things that, can pinpoint people to a certain aspect of interpretation that they cannot escape anymore, then you very often, very quickly get the idea of, yeah, that's being dogmatic. But it's not about that. So you have tons of options today. But if you want to reconstruct the original intention of the composer, the authentic intention, if you would say like that, then tempo is super important. Because even even if a musician today is not interested really in metronome marks, all musicians on a certain level, I would say, are really working with their tempi, because changing tempo changes everything. Not only the articulation, not only the phrasing, not only the touch of the piano, whatever instrument you play, but also the character of the piece. And once you're dealing with that, you know that changing a few beats per minute in a piece is already enough to
Mm-hmm.
make the piece sound different. So it's not hard to understand that if we want to go back in time in our time machine, that the metronome is our time machine. Because
Right.
Beethoven did not give us all these metronome numbers because he thought, well, those tempo indications were like, whatever, you do whatever you want with them. Chopin didn't do that. Schumann, Mendelssohn, we have thousands and thousands of tempo indications of that time.
Well, I think that's an important point. A lot of times, these tempo indications, they're not added by editors later. A lot of times they're added by the composers themselves. This is what they wanted. Is that correct?
Exactly, and that's what makes this discussion so difficult. Because if you go on stage with people like, say, we advocate the WBMP, which is the whole beat metronome practice, where basically, like in still physics today, the full swing of the pendulum, metronome is also a pendulum, is considered to be one unit, and on the other side say, yeah, no, we read the metronome numbers like today. There is not really an in between here, and that makes this whole discussion so difficult. And once if you accept the fact, which is very easy to reconstruct, by the way, that metronome marks are accurate tempo indications. And because you hear sometimes, or actually a lot, people say, yeah, but composers like Czerny is really known for that. Yeah, but he only gave those metronome numbers as a target, as a goal. Those were not meant really to be reached. That's not correct. Those composers, if you whether you talk about Beethoven or you talk about a second rank or third rank or fourth rank composers, they were very serious in their tempo indications. And they had a very specific reason in that time. Two reasons,
What?
actually. Yeah, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So two reasons. First, notation became something that they could not rely upon solely anymore, to just assume that the performer still had, based upon the notation only, the correct tempo in mind. And secondly, because the performers, even early 19th century, actually didn't care anymore about the intentions of the composer. So composers were forced to give metronome numbers in the hope that musicians still would know what their intentions was, and maybe even follow those intentions. But that was very rare in that time.
Wow. And do you attribute that to a rise of virtuosity and different or professional musicians who instead of playing their own things, um, d- made it a career of playing other people's things faster, better, more with more flair? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think a couple of aspects. First of all, we come from the 18th century. We enter the Age of Enlightenment. Beethoven advocated that very French
For
Revolution,
sure.
all that stuff. But this has a major consequence. It changes the social network. Like the bourgeoisie was coming up, basically people who had not the, let's say, the cultural education that the nobleman had still, like in their castles, and there was a tradition of museum music. Suddenly you had conservatories, you had concert halls, and you had an audience that basically wanted to be entertained. So the performing musician became something like, it was not even called a recital back, even 18th century, late 18th century, it was called an exhibition. The performer was being exposed, was being asked to have duels to, and so in that context, it's not surprisingly that musicians wanted to be the best by playing the fastest. We
Right.
have a wonderful quote just recently. I found that by Franz Liszt, and I will be a shock when I bring it on YouTube. But you can have the premiere of this. So Liszt, who was uh, uh, his painting was made, and I think end of the 30s, and he said to the painter, like, basically, we have three ways of playing. One
Okay.
is the authentic way that the composer intended his piece to be played. Secondly, is the same, but adapted to the new instruments. And
Hmm.
thirdly, he said, is basically like I have to play all the time for the audiences, which is they want to hear a charlatan.
Right.
But if you think about this is very hard, and I wouldn't say that people who play like very fast and want to be technically very, above everyone else, but as a charlatan, they cannot help it because we live in that time. But basically, that's the third way of Liszt playing. The reason I think why he quit stage is still the version that we have today and was in the 19th century dominant.
So you don't think he quit playing because he just wanted to focus on writing and composing? You think it had something to do with how music was being treated at that time with the public?
Well, of course, I cannot see in Liszt's head, and I
Right.
don't know if there is any letters that point to that. This quote is really powerful, and it is worth researching that, and maybe someone can do that.
For sure.
But I think that he was on a point of his life, as was, for instance, Marshall was a little bit older, quit stage. I mean, Chopin was, of course, very ill, but when did he play? There was not, those musicians were not in demand anymore when they were focusing on making music. And Liszt was, of course, I think at that time, when he was around 1840, in a position that he could say, "Listen, I'm going to Weimar or wherever, and I become conductor, and I play in private." And strangely enough, if you then go further in time, because that's the interesting point, if you have these points and you can put them together, then you create a three-dimensional context. Later in 1876, we see another important musician, Charles-Marie Widor, who was organist in the Saint-Sulpice in Paris, one of the major organists of that time. He was introduced by the organ builder Cavaillé-Coll to Liszt. He was a famous network at Cavaillé-Coll, so he brought those two together. And so
Okay.
Widor gave an introduction of the organ that Cavaillé-Coll built at the Trocadero church in Paris. And Liszt was very impressed with the young Widor, and he said, "Can I return the favor?" And Widor said, like, "Yeah, maître, huh? Maestro, if I can just hear you practice just 1 hour." And Liszt said, "Even better, I'm staying in the castle of the Irards, the piano builders. So come over every week." I studied there from 9 till 12 before noon, and Widor was there. And then he reported on that, and he said it was the most beautiful period of my life, musically speaking, because Liszt played a lot of Beethoven, Schumann, and he played, stunningly enough, almost half as fast as we do today.
Oh, wow.
And now many people will say, yeah, but Liszt was old, and he was, no, 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 no. Liszt at that time was on the top of his abilities. When you read Clara Schumann, who was always a little bit jealous on Liszt, when Liszt was in a company and Liszt played some scales and some sixths and some thirds, she was like freaking out, like the man never practiced anymore, but he's outperforming all of us. So he could play fast. But it was
Right.
when it came really to the essential in the study room with the young Widor there, he played basically in a tempo that cannot be different from the way that we are advocating to interpret the metronome numbers in. And so then everything becomes three-dimensional, and then it becomes really fascinating, because then you
That
are
is fascinating.
reconstructing a real life reality, I would say.
I mean, I want to ask this kind of simplistic question, but
I'm sorry, my answers are always a little bit
no,
all over the place.
this is beautiful, and I really appreciate you. Again, I appreciate you going on. I love these stories. It's exactly what I'm looking for. What, but so when we talk about a metronome, I mean, a lot of the problems, um, as I understand it, that you're saying is that number one, it's not intended, and we know it's not intended because a lot of the things that were meant to be played quickly, fast, are unplayable. Like when you get to certain speeds, you talk about the Czerny 299, for example, that literally gets to speeds that if you use those exact tempo markings are unplayable. So that's kind of in our mind that's a problem. So how do we solve for that? And part of the solution is your whole
Whole beat.
whole beat. Thank you. Whole beat method, or the idea of the metronome being a full pendulum beat. How does that, like for example, when I set a metronome to 60, that's still my clicks are at 60 beats a minute. So help me understand when we go. I guess what I'm saying is when we play slower, when we have a slower piece, and it says 60 or something, we're not playing at 30. How does that reconcile?
Well, just very simple for your audience also to understand. When you have, for instance, the Opus 299, that's the famous Czerny book of etudes that I think all students have to play still today. Great exercises, by the way. We hate
Yeah.
Czerny for a reason, but that's not him to blame for. It's the way we are teaching his music. So, for instance, for the first etude, he says presto or allegro molto. I don't even know. I think it's presto, but it's basically the same there. He says half note 108. So basically that means if you take that literally every 108 click on the metronome, if that really would indicate the half note, then we would have to play about 14 notes a second, which
Right.
is not hard to imagine. That's not what he meant. If we apply the pendulum system to the metronome, and there are some sources that strongly indicate that, not to forget the Melzel directions itself from 1816, then what it actually does is very simple. The metronome ticks indicate the subdivision of the note value.
Right.
If we are teaching our kids in music school, and we say we want to give time, and they play a piece in quarter notes, we often will indicate the quarter note as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then the bar is over, a 4/4 bar. But the 1 and are exactly the
Right.
things that are indicated by the ticks, and that's called a period. That's a unity, and it goes back, of course, centuries. We can talk for hours about this, but basically that it is. And then this music becomes playable. I would say the Czerny etudes try them in whole beat, so the full beat, 2 clicks per one note value. It's still not for everyone, because then there will still be 7 to 8 notes a second. And I can tell you that's for music school level, not easy. That's fast.
Right. To maintain the clarity and maintain beauty, especially when you're trying to play correct articulations and
Well, and that's required because the prefaces of Czerny are oftentimes not published anymore, and it's hard to find them even. But if you find the original ones, he says for those etudes, like, you start slow until you can play them in the tempo I indicated. So there are
right.
no targets. He wanted you to play those pieces like in tempo, and then you're looking at this and you say, oh my God, until 90 notes a second in the Opus 299. I have a source that's indexing all the etudes of that time, like 1850 or so, was by a student, Max Bauer, a student of the son of Mozart. So very interesting. And he labels this Czerny etudes for the beginner level. I mean, really?
Right. At 14 well, and 14 notes a second, and well, and you have a really great video that I saw showing this and showing how even in some other parts of Czerny you're playing up to 28, 29 notes a second.
29, yeah. The record
And
of Czerny is actually 30 notes a second.
That, I mean, which is unbelievably fast. I mean, and to play it with any kind of clarity at all is impossible. Which
Well,
actually, go
30 notes
ahead.
a second. I mean, let's not. I mean, that's not
That's not
possible.
slow.
And that's for a very short passage in the Opus 31, number 3, I think, where he says, even in the pianoforte school, and it makes this so great. He says, during that bar, don't slow down. I mean, basically, you will have to play 15 notes a second there for like 1 octave, which is possible.
Right.
But then you will feel that you come and at the end of your motoric ability, you cannot do that for 2 or 3 octaves.
So what do critics of your ideas say? I mean, when they see these tempo markings and they say, what do they say that oh, of course Czerny never meant those markings, really? I mean, is that their
The
argument?
well, the critics, I would say, on a serious level, because yeah, on YouTube you can imagine it.
Right.
Everybody, yeah, everybody jumps into the comment section and suddenly becomes an expert. Not downplaying people who are commenting on my channel, really not. But I mean that type. That's common today.
Well,
Everybody has.
yeah, there's a difference between just like people spewing and talking and people with, who have studied this issue and
Yeah,
chiming in.
but I would say people who are on a serious level, like on an academic level, they have one magic word in their publications, and I'm not kidding. I mean, I'm not downplaying their value, but the word is misprints.
Wow.
Yeah, if you read, for instance, the book of Klaus Meeling, who is today still to be seen as the author on Baroque tempi. I mean, when he talks about the French sources, the number of misprints that he attributes to those authors like Mezen and all the others of the French classic academics. I mean, that was the highest level we ever reached
Right.
as humanity. And so they have to assume that a lot of these people just were having troubles with basically adding 1 to 1 equals 2, because that's what, yeah, but that's what we're talking about. They say, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. Czerny metronome marks, yeah, I mean, yeah, what can we say? They were only meant as targets, or Beethoven's metronome was broken, or what have you. There is a deflection of the reality. And my point only is, let's just take those metronome marks, because that's our time machine. The only consequence is we'll have to look at our musical past completely different. And I can understand that's difficult. If you're, I mean, even I was working with Lorenz Gadian, the author of Stachtens on Pendelschlag, which is basically the guy who started everything on a serious level, is this book. I knew him from 2010, and then he came here every year. He's a priest, so he spent his holiday with us.
Okay.
He's a great musician. It took me 7 years before I realized that what he was writing is actually, there is no other reality that can be true. So if I need 7 years, I can understand that for someone else it takes time. And I also can understand that if you have been publicizing your entire life on a certain system, or you have made 5,000 recordings according to a certain interpretation, that it's hard to say, maybe I have to look it over again.
Rethink.
But that's the nature of wanting to go back in time. And if I can add something to that, it's very normal that we make mistakes, because humanity is not yet ready to look back.
Yeah.
We are still looking forward all the time, because that's in our nature. That's in our nature. If I I'm working as an organ consultant, so as an architect to restore historical organs. But if I sit together with people in a church restoration where the organ is just part of the project, I mean, we have these old churches here in Europe and we restore them. If things are preserved, we're not touching them. But if things are not preserved, I raise my finger and say, why not reconstruct that in the style of the church? And then everybody will look like, really? Really? We have to do something new. And then comes this entrance door in plexiglass, I'm like an ugly artifact in this beautiful Baroque church. And people come in, ordinary people say, what's this door doing here? But I mean, there's no one yet ready to say, listen, me as an architect, I serve the idea of reconstruction. That's
Well, and
not there yet.
it's why we, it's interesting because when again, culturally, when we've heard something a certain way for so many decades and a century, I mean, we've heard things a certain way. For example, the Chopin Opus 10 #1 that I saw on your YouTube channel, you know, which is quite slow compared to anything you ever hear in a concert hall.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, it's shockingly slow. And I'm curious, you know, because Chopin is an interesting case, Chopin and Liszt, because they're kind of in that. I think you would consider that part of during the change that was happening where we were moving to single beat. Am I right in saying
It's a
that?
little bit more complex, but yeah, I know what you.
Right.
Yeah.
So these are interesting where they kind of straddled both sides of the curtain a little bit, or we're probably, I think in your opinion, more in the whole beat section, but the world was moving, and what so that specific piece, that Chopin 10 #1 that I heard you play, like I'd never heard anything quite like that, and I'm curious what kind of reaction you get to that, or what what's the documentation, or how do you feel about when you play a piece that's so shockingly slow like that?
Well, yeah, there's a lot I can say today on this
Right.
topic. Certainly, Chopin is one of the key figures, I would say, in reconstructing everything. But there are many levels to this. For me, this is not so much of a shock. If you know that Chopin was a really Bach addict and that he was teaching the well-tempered claviers or the well-tempered keyboard, at those days still called the well-tempered clavichord, by the way. But if you then go to Bach's first preludes and you take just the third and you put it on top, then you have Chopin's Etude. Once you see that relationship, once you compare the notation, then you say, okay, the tempo ordinario for Bach, which is the normal tempo, which basically most people still play that today. That prelude of Bach, about in my tempo for the Chopin Etude, it's similar. What's the tempo indication of that? The first etude, I actually forgot, but it's something like Allegro. Don't quote me on this. But then Chopin gives also accents on every quarter note.
Huh.
I mean, indicating tech on every quarter note. So all these things together, yeah, I mean, I can understand and people say, okay, when I hear Martha Argerich play this piece literally in single beat, she can manage that. I mean, we're not talking about the most extreme pieces here. So some
Right.
pieces are still possible to play according to what we call single beat modern reading. I would say like 20 to 30% of the fast metronome marks, maybe of the known pieces we can manage, all the rest not. So there is 70% of the fast metronome marks, I would say, no way. And people are not playing like that either. So that's an important disclaimer to make to your audience, that what we advocate on our channel is not half as fast as we hear today. We don't hear a single beat performance practice for the simple reason that it's not possible. It's not possible. So Chopin.
And if it's not possible, I mean, if it were possible, it may not be listenable.
Well, we make sometimes these. Lately, we had a video on Beethoven's fifth transcription by Liszt, so the
Right.
symphony, which was, we do some co-publications with Wolfgang Weller, a pianist. So we published some of his recordings on our channel. We did, so Alberto Sanna, a young pianist who joined us, I did the Fifth Symphony on my old piano. I mean, reconstruction of an old piano in Czerny's transcription. Fascinating, by the way. Very rarely played.
Yeah.
But then people started commenting like, yeah, but Liszt, these transcriptions are like the pinnacle of virtuosity, and like the way Wolfgang plays this. I mean, it's still not easy, but not so difficult. But then I took Katsaris, who basically became famous playing the Liszt Beethoven transcriptions, and I checked his tempi. Well, for the first movement, he is about there, but for all the others, he is like 25% below Beethoven's metronome mark, even for an allegro movement. And now, that's not possible. That's not possible that a pianist of the level of Katsaris, already with an allegro movement, I mean, that's almost in the half of the tempo range, needs to slow down 25%. Then I digitally upgraded that tempo to what Beethoven had in mind. And when you hear that from a pianist, we are used to orchestra. But when you hear a piano playing, then you will run away screaming. Like, really, this is like. And so, yeah, what other point can you make that then suddenly, yeah, okay, Liszt was not serious about the tempo, or it is a piano transcription. He didn't want you to play in that tempo. Yeah, but why does he publish the metronome marks then in his score? Why does
Right. And
Gianni publish them? That's not an argument. You cannot make from the exception the general rule. And so, yeah, the only solution is then to apply the what we call the WBMP, the whole beat metronome practice. But that's not easy to accept. I get the point, but that doesn't
no,
change
that
the
it,
facts.
so what, again, I want to go back to my question about slower pieces, like for example the beginning of the Pathétique, you know, where you have this very slow section. Do you think that that the with the with the whole beat philosophy, that actually that these slower movements, these slower passages were meant to be played as slow as you contend they are?
Absolutely. And you will hear the Pathétique soon. And if you open your mind, it will blow you away. I mean, we're talking here about the Grave, which is the
Uh-huh.
slowest tempo you have. There's nothing
Right.
slower than that. And just listen to performances today and think if that's the slowest character of a piece that you can have. So Alberto actually played that beautifully on the Fritz last week. And the thing is, of course, if you say to yourself, now I'm going to listen to this Pathétique de Grave and I'm going to hear why it is not possible, then you're closing your heart. There's nothing I can do for you.
Right.
But if you just sit down and say, let the music absorb me, of course it's a Pathétique. So if listeners want to go to the Pathétique in the future, we'll be here, I think, end of July on the channel. Take your time and take 1 week, every day one listen, and then you will convert it. But I give you one example of an interesting thing that happened. We looked at Hans van Bülow's score. So Hans van Bülow was a student of Clara Wieck's father, and then
Okay.
later of Liszt. He writes at the beginning of the Pathétique about same metronome number as Czerny, by the way. The 32nd note, so ta-tam, ta-tam, you have to perceptibly hear the gap, the articulation gap, like the Bach prelude of the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Well, this is a strong tempo indicator because you need to pum, pum, tum, pum, and
Oh wow.
suddenly you are in almost the French 18th century. Isn't that curious? And so all these things come together. Once you open your mind for it, you will start seeing things. That's important. Only when you accept this could very well be an historical truth. What many people do is just sit down at the piano at best, because many people just talk about it and not try things out, but then try to solve the problem while they're playing, and that doesn't work. You have like a doctor or researchers who invent a cure against this disease. They make it and they try it out and they see at the end if it worked or not. They're not, I mean, during testing the cure out, which is in our case playing, you have to try to make it work. And when
Right.
you do that, I can promise you there is a world that opens for you that you say, how is it possible that we have so much difficulties accepting this? How is that? How come?
That is interesting because, yeah, I mean, you do have to sell out and you know, open your mind, open your heart to these new sounds, because they are new sounds. And that actually brings me to another question, which is, again, almost an insolvable. Well, let me back up a little bit. I want to ask a different question, and that is about technique, and specifically pedaling technique, because I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, both as players and teachers, and I rarely hear it from a historical standpoint. But what talk to me about how these slower tempos, how they affect pedal technique, and what composers meant when they wrote their pedaling.
That's a very complex issue, but generally speaking, I have to say, just a little story here. When Alberto Sano, the young guy, young Italian who knocked on my door, almost in the tempo of the Fifth Symphony, I would say. Yeah, no, just kidding. But he is such a. I mean, he was so enthusiastic from the beginning. When he was playing for the first time on my Fritz pianoforte, he was pedaling all over the place, and I said to him, "You're losing the individual quality of the tone." But that's what many pianists learn today. Just pedal as long as it has some kind of clarity. Don't look into the score. Now, I asked him if he would be fine just by taking it a little back, the pedaling, and just try. And next time he came, he said, "I have better news for you. What if we stop saying that those composers were idiots, quote unquote, and didn't know what they were writing about?" Because, listen, if you go in the 18th century, like Beethoven sonatas, half of them almost are composed in the 18th century, then there is a bridge period, and there the score doesn't have always pedal indication. But from a certain point in time, Beethoven started to indicate pedal indications. So, but yes, when you indicate pedal in a few places, what does it mean for the places where the pedal is not indicated? And so we took the philosophy lately. What would happen if we try to do that? Combine that with fingerings. We today are taught like finger substitutions, do it all. It was not a practice in those days. So we combine those two things, which is not easy. But it gives you this clarity in playing. It's unbelievable. The thing is,
Wow.
you have to learn a new technique of releasing notes. What happens today is the pedal, the sustaining pedal, is the rescuer of fast playing. Pianists have not the time anymore to end the tone like in a quality way. The pedal will serve them as an ending of the tones. That's basically what it is. And you see that, I make the point anyway. You see that also in the early music movement. If people play on fortepiano or on a Steinway, it is not so much different, because also fortepiano players are using the pedal all over the place. And it was not a practice. When you open your mind for this, then you'll read in Czerny's part 4 of the Pianoforte School. That's a part he published later as in which he gave insights in new music. And he gives an overview of keyboard, talks about the clavichord even, 1846. And he says pedal use, Thalberg was the first in the 30s who used the pedal in a way to hold one note and play like ornamentation with his hands. So people had the idea. He had 3 hands. So if you think about this, that only in 1830 this became like a kind of modern practice. I mean, then we're traveling with Beethoven in a time that we have no. Imagine how it was. And
Yeah.
pedaling, that's a great question. Pedaling is one of the kingmakers of WBMP because that is only possible in that tempo. That's at least I think.
So in other words, we could get somebody, some freak athlete, for example, that might be able to play at 29 beats a minute or something, or 29 beats a second or something. But there's no way you could pedal the way that's indicated.
Well, no way. I wouldn't say that, but sometimes things comes together, and
Yeah,
it
right.
comes
That makes
together
sense.
in this way.
Right. All these things, just like, okay, if this is true and this is true, this is likely what's going on here. Is that they're
Because
playing
if
these
we
whole,
talk about pedaling, and we talked about Chopin, if I may, but if you go to
yeah.
Chopin, I was taught in conservatory. I had lessons first from a teacher who studied in Poland, and I've said it a lot. Miraculously, if you study in Poland, you by default become a Chopin specialist. Yeah, but I mean, that's in a way it's ridiculous, but that's how it works. I mean, as
Right.
if we have somewhere still on this planet the Chopin tradition alive. I'm sorry for the people listening from Poland, but that's not true. No one was there. Chopin doesn't live anymore, anyways.
Right. He's long gone.
But he was still telling me all the way, Chopin's pedaling, he was known for his pedaling, which is true. He was very accurate with his pedaling, which is true. And if you look into his scores, he was very accurate in his pedaling. It's like one measure here, then stop here, then again there. I have to tell you, I was always puzzled with his pedalings because at first they don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
They really don't make sense. Just look at them closely. And I mean, be sure to have a kind of original score because they are changed always.
Sure, sure.
But it ties into this tone quality, which you also with Chopin will only get if you just bring it down a little bit. And
Huh.
then it works. And then it works.
Well, that actually brings me to another question, which has to do with the instruments themselves. And one of the things I do also appreciate about your channel is you have this wonderful assortment of historical instruments that you play. I mean, they are gorgeous and they sound beautiful, but they sound way different than our modern instruments.
Yeah, true.
And clearly, like I sincerely believe Beethoven, for example, had a vision of what the piano could someday become, because he writes things that are impossible on the pianos that he wrote, that he wrote for at the time. But how does playing on modern instruments affect how we interpret these tempo markings and these tones that we're trying to create that were only heard on these historical instruments? How does that affect what you're
Yeah, well,
trying to
that's
do?
an interesting point you bring up. Firstly, I would say Beethoven, until I found a work that somehow corrects me, has never written something that was not possible on his piano. I mean, he would be a very big idiot if he would write music that only was sounding great 50 years later. So that's I cannot blame you for having that idea, because it was with me also when I was in Amsterdam,
Yeah,
still a young guy. We had all this. Yeah, the Steinway is the Steinway is a different instrument. It serves different music.
right.
Now, another question, and people from the early music movement would call me really an idiot when I say this, but I think it's true. When Beethoven would have lived 200 years, he would today play the Steinway. There is no doubt about that. Why do I know? Because I do not see one single composer musician in the history that chooses for an instrument that was 50 years before him built.
Right.
So Bülow played on a German later piano. I mean, you know what I mean.
You always want, hey, we all love great gear. We want the best and greatest stuff.
Well, the thing is, they composed also different music. They didn't compose Beethoven sonatas anymore. So to say that my Fritz copy here that I have of the Frenzel is an original 1825, the clavichord here is a copy of a mid-18th century clavichord. Those instruments were perfect. There is nothing in that concept you can change. And that's something. The Irar here is an instrument. Well, you can say the Steinway sounds a little bit stronger, but has also a more a fatter tone, I would say. The Irar is still very linear, very transparent. So by changing the instruments, you gain something and you lose something. So, but having said all of that, you can play in this way on a Steinway. And that's something that also Alberto, he's coming from this mainstream performance practice. I mean, the guy studied in Colburn, like a private school. It's the highest level of piano that we are talking about. So he hopefully in the future will make also the bridge with modern piano playing, to show that this way of playing is not only for the historical instruments. You can do that. And maybe sometimes if your piano is in a very dry acoustics, that you want to have a little bit more pedal or whatever, that you adapt it a little bit to another instrument, that's fine. But the basics can be the same. And the basics for me, and we come back to the beginning of our talk, is the tempo. I mean, I rather listen to Beethoven on a Steinway in the correct tempo than on an old Hammerflügel in the wrong tempo, because changing tempo changes everything, and certainly the character of the music. So yeah, I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I appreciate your perspective on that. That's huge. You also have a series of recordings available on your website. You want to talk about that for a minute, and what you have available for people who want to come and support you?
Yeah, that's great. So sometimes people come on in the comment section and say, yeah, all this talk about tempo, why not play? Well, we have now, I think, 279 recordings available on our channel. And I must say, I'm consistent. I was consistent with this from the start of my YouTube channel. Basically started my YouTube channel just to share music. I played the clavichord only at the time. But as a musician, you play and then the beauty just disappears. And I thought, yeah, I have this camera that can film. So why not film myself? When you have this platform, 2014, I actually started to think about it 2013, a little bit too late. But YouTube was not YouTube of today; it was still very early on. And yeah, you can check my oldest videos. Like, yeah, if you really want to have a good laugh, then it's great to see. But it was a great thing because suddenly, my first video I know had 30 views in 2 weeks. But then suddenly, except from my friends and my mother, there was someone else who came on the channel and say, "Hey, great recording." I thought, really? How did you find this? And so people started to ask for other music, for other things. And before I knew it, I had a little community that was really fun to work with. And of course, yeah, then suddenly came the idea of this pianoforte, which I had for a long time, recording Beethoven. And then I had a long conversation with my wife, Anya, and said, listen, I have to explain people why I am playing like this. Because if I play the Waldstein the way I do, and now actually Alberto recorded that, I'm going to record the Waldstein too, but anyways, doesn't matter. Then people will say, yeah, listen, but why are you playing that so slow? So I took the decision
They're
to,
all going to think you're Glenn Gould.
yeah, I mean, it would be an honor to me, but because I really adore
Oh,
Glenn
he's
Gould.
amazing.
But basically what I would say is like, yeah, you can play like that, but basically you behave like a clown because we know it's not like that, while all this research of 20, 30 years is behind. So yeah, then I took the decision, we'll bring it on the channel, and that basically started what it became today.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I've listened to several of them. I look forward to listening to more. I'd strongly encourage our listeners to check out Authentic Sound on YouTube or authenticsound.org and look at the vast material. You have a lot of written material there too, where you go into a lot of these historical ideas and what your thoughts on them are. Excuse me. We have again with us Wim Winters from authenticsound.org, and I want to just finish off by giving you a few minutes. Just what can people, if people were to either play or listen to your recordings, something that's done in this whole time kind of paradigm, what should they expect to hear, and how would you recommend people go about listening to that?
That's a great question. And it's a question that your listeners only can answer for themselves. If you open yourself for the idea, I mean, I would say go first, listen to some theoretical videos that we make about sources and see if what I'm saying makes sense. Do I look like an idiot? Maybe some say I do. I mean, and worse than that, I wouldn't mind. But of course, then the music will not work. Go to listen to the Fifth Symphony. Go listen to the trio that we recorded lately, Beethoven's Trio, Opus 38, and see what the music does with you. And if you're a musician, go sit down at your piano or your instrument and just play, experiment. Um, don't take for granted what people say, what teachers say, like those metronome marks of Czerny, don't pay attention. The guy didn't know what he wanted. It was just like for publicity. No, try them out for yourself and see what the music does. Again, we're talking about reconstruction of a time that's pre-industrial. Just think about it. Do we run the 100 meters slower than 100 years before? And just think about it. Once you see that, it starts to deconstruct by itself. And the great thing, and then I close with that, the great thing is, I cannot underline this enough, once you have seen more, once you have felt the enormous emotional power that this music had originally, as we think, there is no way back. You want to stick there. It's a musical paradise. I have people on the channel who say, even if this theory turns out to be wrong, I will never be able to go back to faster performances. But good news is the theory is not wrong, and we will prove that in the new book that we are writing and hopefully published this year. That will be a major work. Yeah.
I look forward to that, and I've so enjoyed having you on the show. I hope we can do
Thank
this
you.
again. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure for me
And
too. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And so again, this is Mike Leavitt with And If Love Remains. You can find more information about And If Love Remains at www.andifloveremains.com. We have a little bit of a merch thing. So if you need a face mask or And If Love Remains mug, you can pick one up there. We're very grateful for. Oh, and you can find information for Vin and his organization at authenticsound.org, as well as the Authentic Sound YouTube channel. Again, we want to thank him for being on the show. Look forward to, let's do it again, shall we?
Thank you so much. Sure.
All
Pleasure.
right, sounds great. Okay. Thank you. Oh my gosh, that was such a pleasure for me. I learned a lot, and I'm grateful for your time.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, it's always wonderful when people reach out to us and just to allow us to share the things that we have to say, because it's
Well,
not always easy.
yeah, no, and that's the thing. Like, I really felt like I wanted to get your story out. As I mean, I wanted to push back on a few things, but I really wanted you to tell your full story as much as you could. And I honestly feel like there's a lot more that we could talk about, and maybe we can someday. I love the idea of even like historical tunings. I think it's an interesting.
Oh yeah. Oh, box of
Man,
Pandora opening.
yeah, I mean it's fascinating stuff. So yeah, let's continue this conversation sometime. I'd really appreciate that.
That's great. Okay.
All right. I think I'm going to stop recording